The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales Radio Show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic, and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome. My name is Charles Christian. I'm the host of the Weird Tales Radio Show, available on podcast and on internet radio, and I'd like to thank you for joining me. On today's show, we have part one of an interview with an old friend of mine called Greg Bufithis, and we're looking at the cultural impact, but a sort of a historical cultural impact of the moon on mankind, and it's really to coincide with the fact that this year saw the 50th anniversary of the moon landing, the first moon landing by Neil Armstrong, or if you prefer the conspiracy theory, the first fake moon landing. What else have we got? Well, we're also going to be looking at popes who were sorcerers. Yes, black magic naughtiness in the Vatican. Oh yes, we like to give you an eclectic mixture. Now, on with the show. Now here's a bit of an oddity some of you may recall, and if you do, we'd love to hear from you. And it's the fact that from the late 60s to the mid-ish 70s, there was a craze for albums, vinyl as they were in those days, on occult and witchcraft topics, both in the UK and the US. These were spoken word albums, including narrations of rituals, spells, and in some instances accompanied by frequently bizarre music. Now, there's, for example, The Art of Witchcraft by Barbetta, a.k.a. Barbetta the Sexy Witch. Anyone got that one on your collection? And then there is Alex and Maxine Sanders, A Witch is Born, which is, sorry for the use of the word witch. Alex and Maxine Sanders, well known in the UK Wiccan witchcraft tradition. And this was their discussion of initiation into a coven. They perform rites, was advertised apparently in Rolling Stone magazine, and generally, I say, gives you a flavour of what it is like to be introduced into a Wiccan coven. And then we also have Louise Huebner, The Official Witch of LA, that's her title, and she made a record called Seduction Through Witchcraft, which was out on Warner Brothers in 1969, and also features some psychedelic stroke experimental electronic music in the background, while Huebner, with a raspy, heavily reverberated voice, makes spooky, kitschy sounding descriptions of such things as the earthquake spell for unwanted lovers, and why an orgy is a good way to release your magic powers. Anyway, there's another one here, Barbara the Grey Witch, which was an album by Barbara the Grey Witch, and not forgetting, on a slightly more serious note, Witchcraft, An Adventure in Demonology. This was from Capitol Records, and it featured a Vincent Price. And he gives a spoken word guide to the history and events of witchcraft from the Middle Ages right through until the supposed cone of power that was generated in England's New Forest to stop Hitler invading the UK during World War II. Vincent also discusses how to invoke spirits, demons and unseen forces, and how to communicate with spirits. Apparently, the original pressing of the album included a small booklet giving instructions on the creation of a hand of glory, which we've covered before on this show, which is basically a magical item made from the severed left hand of a hanged man. Not quite sure where you would get those easily in the UK in 1969, but there you go. Anyway, any of those albums, we'd love to hear from you if you've got them. There's a suggestion that they were banned because of their nature, but it actually seems more likely that they were sold poorly and remaindered and never made through to a second pressing. So there you go. Occult albums. I should just add that you can actually find some extracts from Louise Hubner's Seduction Through Witchcraft album on YouTube. No pictures, no images, just the sound. And now for a special. It's the Weird Tales radio show's guide to the papacy's 7 deadliest sinners. Yes, we're looking at the topic of sorcery at the Vatican. Mention the Pope today, and the image it immediately summons up for many people is of a saintly old man standing on a balcony in Rome, blessing the crowds gathered in St. Peter's Square, calling for peace, love and harmony in the world. Ah, nice. However, historically, there is a tradition that, far from representing all that is good and holy in the Roman Catholic Church, some popes were actually practicing sorcerers who had called upon dark forces to help them ascend the throne of St. Peter. Before we look at the lives of the 7 biggest sinners ever to wear the papal crown, first need to set the context for what we see in the present papacy, the Vatican state, is really only a relatively recent iteration. For the best part of 1,000 years, only ending with the reunification of Italy in 1870, the papacy was also a significant temporal power, ruling a large part of Italy. And before that, the Pope spent several hundred years embroiled with doctrinal disputes with other elements of within the Christian Church, deciding which were orthodox teachings and which were unorthodox heresies. The net result was frequently controversial decisions by popes, earned them lots of enemies both within the Church and internationally, as they all tried to influence papal policy and fight for control around the lands surrounding the city of Rome. In fact, these disputes were sometimes so onerous that disaffected groups of cardinals would elect rival popes, known as anti-popes, a bit like antimatter, and they would have their own courts and be set up in opposition to the official pope. Given this background, just as character assassination plays an important part in national politics today, so in the years between the mid-5th century and the late 16th century, papal politics also saw the widespread use of character assassination. Except along with allegations of sexual peccadillos and financial corruption, no change with that today, earlier popes might also find themselves being accused of sorcery. But could allegations of sorcery sometimes have been true? The first of our malevolent 7 is Pope Leo, who was pope from AD 440 to 461. He was later known as Saint Leo the Great, and he's actually the earliest pope to have been accused of the practice of sorcery. This is despite the fact that he's been described as one of the most important popes in the Church's history. But he was accused of black magic. But I think this is fair to put it down to purely jealousy and politics. But among the bishops who it was involved with doctrinal disputes over things such as Christology and Manichaeism, which was later declared a heresy. So he made enemies, but the allegations of sorcery, I think we can say, unfound. His almost namesake, Pope Leo III, who was the Pope in 795 to 816. This Pope had enemies from the very outset of his reign, and indeed was attacked and almost killed by armed men in the employ of a previous Pope who'd been forced into exile. Oh yes, that's how good it was. He was restored by Charlemagne, the famous Frankish king, and Leo subsequently crowned Charlemagne as the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Unfortunately, this upset the Eastern Roman Empire, which was in Constantinople. Look it up in the history books. And as a result, Leo was accused of adultery, perjury, and sorcery. Now, what's interesting is that some 700 years after Pope Leo III's death, a grimoire, or magical text, called the Enchiridion of Pope Leo was published in France in 1523. And it claims to be based on a collection of prayers, including spells, providing protection against various evils and misfortunes, everything from secret enemies to cures for animal bites, that Pope Leo gave Charlemagne as a gift on his coronation. Now, it's quite likely Pope Leo would have given something to Charlemagne, probably a prayer book, but there's no evidence in either the Vatican archives or surviving records of the Carolingian court of any magical text being donated, and would have been a bit pointless as Charlemagne was illiterate. Suspicions that the Enchiridion of Pope Leo was fake is also supported by the fact that the first known version of the text dates from 1633, over 800 years after its supposed author's death. This, however, did not prevent the grimoire from being listed in police records relating to the notorious Affair of Poisons. This is in France, when the French high society, during the period 1677 to 1682, was rocked by allegations of witchcraft, infanticide, murder, and Satanism. And definitely worth reading up on the Affair of the Poisons. It's what happens when aristocrats with too much money and too much time on their hands start dabbling in dark arts. And the Enchiridion of Pope Leo, which you can buy on Amazon even today, is now become a foundation of folk magic and hoodoo traditions in the French Caribbean colonies, including Haiti. Next up, Pope Sylvester II, who was on the St. Peter's throne from the year 999 to 1003. History's been rather unkind to him. Known for most of his life as Gerbert of Aurillac, he was French, he was a scholar and a scientist, and now recognised as one of the most brilliant minds of his time. He studied in Spain, where the Moors taught the work of Aristotle, and according to some accounts, was responsible for the reintroduction into Europe of the abacus and the armillary sphere, or astrolabe, as well as such innovations as the decimal system and Arabic numerals, replacing Roman numerals. And he studied mathematics, astrology, and astronomy. He was also the first French pope, and once again, we see international politics muddying the waters, as this made him unpopular in Rome, which was obviously an Italian area, and just 2 years after becoming Pope, he was forced out of Rome by an armed uprising. What seems to be the issue here is the fact that at this time in history, when what we now call modern scientific methods were little understood, there was a widespread belief that any knowledge not found in the Bible must have been learned from the devil. It's therefore not surprising that within 60 years of Pope Sylvester's death, medieval chroniclers were writing about the black legend of Gerbert of Aurillac, describing him as a necromancer who won the papacy through black magic spells and made a pact with a female demon called Meridiana. The most detailed account can be found in the English chronicle William of Malmesbury's text, and according to his version of the black legend, Gerbert while studying maths and astrology in the Moorish cities of Cordoba and Seville, learned sorcery and stole a book of spells from an Arabian magician. Gerbert fled Spain, pursued by the magician, who could trace the thief by the stars. However, Gerbert, aware of the pursuit, hid by hanging beneath a wooden bridge, where, suspended between heaven and earth, he was invisible to the magician. Remember that one, if you've ever been chased? The legend goes on to say that after Gerbert had renounced all earthly loves, Meridiana also satisfied, in the words of another chronicler, all his carnal lusts. However, along with providing sexual services, Meridiana was also an oracle who would answer his questions, usually with a yes or no. Then came the moment of downfall for Gerbert, who was now Pope Sylvester. In the year 1003, he announced he was going to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, but Meridiana warned him that if he ever said Mass in Jerusalem, the key bit is said Mass in Jerusalem, the devil would come for him and he would die. Fearing for his life and soul, Sylvester cancelled the pilgrimage, but instead read Mass in the Church of Santa Croce in Rome. It was only after he'd completed the service that he learned the full name of the church was the Church of Santa Croce Jerusalem, or the Holy Cross of Jerusalem. Yes, he had said Mass in Jerusalem. Recognising the prophecy had come true, Sylvester was resigned to his fate. He had a bed put in the chapel and summoned his cardinals, confessing that he had dealt with the demons. And then he died. Incidentally, the inscription on Gerbert's tomb reads in part, Iste locus Sylvestris membre sepultae, ventura domino concret ad sonitum, or this place will yield to the sound of the last trumpet and the limbs of buried Sylvester at the advent of the Lord, which has given rise to a legend that if you hear bones rattling in his tomb, that's a sign that the current pope is about to die. Yeah. Okay, and next up, a couple of hundred years later, Pope Honorius III, 1216 to 1227. He's best known for launching the Fifth Crusade to retake Jerusalem and the Holy Land. It failed spectacularly, and also for approving the Dominican and Franciscan orders of friars. However, all his good work in life had been overshadowed by later rumours that he was also the author of a grimoire. Called the Constitution of Honorius, it discusses the value of occult knowledge in the church and how by summoning or raising demonic entities you can learn to control them. It also contains invocations of demonic entities for every day of the week and talks about priests needing to fast for a certain amount of time and to sacrifice animals in order to help with the binding of evil spirits. In reality, this grimoire was not published until the early 17th century, so again some 400 years after the Pope's death, and appears to have been an entirely commercial venture with the Pope's name just added to it for authenticity. And in fact, it contains Christian and Kabbalistic elements and also deals with the rites of exorcism. Another fake then. This did not stop the 19th century French occultist Eliphas Levi describing it in the following terms. The mystery of darksome evocations expounded therein with a terrific knowledge concealed under superstitious and sacrilegious forms. Fastings, watchings, profanation of mysteries, allegorical ceremonies and bloody sacrifices are combined with artful malice. Moving on, some 70 years after Pope Honorius, we have Pope Boniface VIII. 1294 to 1303, and he had a long-running dispute with King Philip IV of France. This resulted in the Pope excommunicating the French king, who retaliated by abducting the Pope and having him beaten up. As the Pope was 73 when this happened, he died just 1 month after the attack. But this wasn't the end of the story. For this King Philip, and this is the same monarch who launched the campaign to destroy the Knights Templars, this king first had his agents spread a rumour that Pope Boniface had died insane, gnawing the flesh and bones from his hands before beating his brains out against a wall. As it happens, there was an inadvertent exhumation of the Pope's tomb in 1605, and this revealed that the suggestions were untrue. He was actually quite well preserved, his fingers hadn't been eaten, and he hadn't dashed away his brains. However, this didn't stop the King Philip from then going on to pressurise the succeeding Pope, Clement V, to hold a posthumous trial of Pope Boniface on charges of sodomy, heresy and sorcery. In fact, those are very much the same charges that King Philip waged against the Knights Templars, so clearly King Philip had a bit of a thing about sodomy. As for the sorcery, it was claimed that Boniface had made a pact with demons, which he conjured up regularly, that he kept an imp in a ring on his finger, and, when still a cardinal, had sacrificed a cock in a black magic spell one night in a garden. It's also said that when he died, Boniface confessed to his demonic pacts on his deathbed, and at the moment of his death caused so much thunder and tempest, with dragons flying in the air and vomiting flames, and such lightning and other prodigies, that the people of Rome believed the whole city was going to be swallowed up into the abyss. As it happened, Pope Boniface was exonerated of all charges by an ecumenical council meeting in 1312, some 9 years after he died. And then we got Anti-Pope, as opposed to Uncle Pope, I know, can't resist the corny joke. Anti-Pope John the 23rd, who was on the throne from 1410 to 1415 and should not be confused with the modern Pope John the 23rd, who died in 1963. Now, this Anti-Pope John was a lawyer and a cardinal who was elected Pope when a faction of the College Cardinals clashed with the reigning patriarch, Pope Gregory the 22nd. And without getting bogged down into church history, at this time there was also another anti-pope, Benedict the 13th. And to try to end this schism, the Council of Constance ruled in 1414 that all three popes should resign and we should have fresh elections and elect a brand new pope. Fearing for his future, not surprisingly, Anti-Pope John fled, apparently disguised as a postman. No, I don't know what a medieval postman looks like. But he was subsequently arrested, tried and convicted for the crimes of heresy, simony, that's selling church appointments for money, schism and immorality. He was also accused of piracy, rape, sodomy, murder, sorcery and incest, but these charges were not pursued. Phew. Despite the gravity of the charges, he spent little over a year in prison and subsequently was made the Cardinal Bishop of Frascati in Italy by the new Pope, a post that John held until his death some 3 years later. Official historical sources suggest that the reason John was released from prison was the Medici banking family, to whom he was related, paid a huge bribe or ransom to secure his freedom. However, the unofficial version describes his apparently miraculous escape. Bearing in mind, as he'd been convicted of heresy, he could have been burned at the stake. It's supposedly down to the actions of Abramelin the Mage, a Jewish sorcerer who lived in the German city of Worms. Abramelin is also claimed to be the author of another grimoire called The Book of the Sacred Magic of Abramelin the Mage, which became a core text at the end of the 19th century of the British occultists MacGregor Mathers of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and Aleister Crowley and his Thelema movement. The grimoire's text can be found online. And finally, the last of our 7 deadly sinners, Pope Sixtus, V, 1585 to 1590. Now, historically, he's a key figure in the Counter-Reformation. He excommunicated Queen Elizabeth of England and King Henry of Navarre, and he supported King Philip of Spain's plans to send the Armada to invade England. Boo, yes. He was also a ruthless ruler within Rome and the Papal States. He raised taxes to restore public finances, demolished large parts of Rome to create new roads, plazas, bridges, fountains, palaces and public buildings, and he stamped out lawlessness and banditry in the surrounding countryside. In fact, it's said there were more heads of brigands on spikes across the Ponte Sant'Angelo in Rome than melons for sale in the marketplace. That's a nice little analogy for you. But inevitably, he made his enemies. In fact, his urban reconstruction projects displaced so many people in Rome and created such ill will that it was still loathed by Roman citizens 300 years later, when the first place the city council knocked down to make way for a railway station was one of his old palaces. His unpopularity undoubtedly lies in the root of the rumour that Sixtus sold his soul to the devil to gain the papacy. According to this legend, the devil granted Sixtus a 6-year reign. However, after just 5 years, the Pope fell gravely ill with malarial fever, and the devil appeared at his bedside one night in late August 1590 to collect his soul. The Pope protested he still had another year remaining in his contract. However, the devil pointed out he was foreclosing on his soul 1 year early because Sixtus had recently ordered the execution of a young man who, according to the law, was 1 year too young to be sentenced to death. Having no answer to this, Pope Sixtus closed his eyes one final time and died. And there you have it. Allegations of sorcery have not been made against any subsequent popes since the death of Pope Sixtus, so far.
You're listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian.
And now time for our interview with Gregory Bufithis. And this is to but to link in with the fact that it was 50 years ago this year, this summer, that man first set foot on the moon. And we're looking at the moon as the impact it's had on literature and culture down the centuries. Who's Greg Bufithis, you ask? Well, he describes himself as a bit of a freelance lawn technology tart, juggling information technology, journalism, law, and digital publishing. He's actually been a little bit modest there. He's actually a digital media and telecom attorney, and he's also studied neuroscience and artificial intelligence, and much of his work has been as a legal advisor to the fashion and media industries on various projects. And he also is the founder and CEO of a company called Project Council Media, which handles media production for fashion and media clients. And if you're wondering about the slightly crackling line, this was because we were carrying the interview out over Skype to Greg's home on the Greek island of Crete. And it's my great pleasure to be talking this morning to Greg Bufithis. Now, Greg and I know each other digitally for a long time, and we normally talk about such exciting topics as e-discovery, WoW, and cybersecurity. However, Greg's been looking into the impact the moon has had on culture. That be right to say?
I think so. I began prepping, as it were, for the 50th celebration about a year ago. I had been invited by the Smithsonian Institution to to do some filming at the, for lack of a better phrase, Space Center, which is located outside of D.C. in Virginia near Dulles Airport. We're doing a special video for the Italian tourist office. Mm-hmm. And that involves doing a movie about the Rome Observatory. And that led us to Washington. And in the process of that, it got me kind of pumped up again about the moon, which has been something that has been, I'd say, a focus of my attention for years since I was a kid, but not the literature. And I got lucky enough because I met a guy named David Seed at the University of Oxford, and he hooked me into all kinds of things, and I just kind of took off with it.
Before going into that, I mean, we tend to think of the moon more, I do, more in the sense of movies, going back to what was that one in the 1890s where they fire the cannon and it lands in the moon's eye or something like that?
Yeah, that's a very good point. During that period, the Lumiere brothers in France
brothers. Yep.
They had pretty much at that point perfected camera work, and it allowed them to do all kinds of special effects, some good, some bad. But I think that segment, which is actually quite short, captured people's imagination. And I think it was that led the movies to just go, gangbusters. I mean, there's obviously a lot of short segments that were produced after that, similar to the Lumiere brothers. And I think it might have put some of the literature in the shade, and I don't think people realized how far back it actually went. I started working on a blog post not too long ago trying to show that the moon, being Earth's only natural satellite, was the subject of not only science but literature. And the first known piece that I could find, and that was again at the suggestion of David Seed, was this 2nd century Syrian writer whose name was Lucian, and he wrote what David and some other researchers have thought to be as the first science fiction narrative ever. And what he did was he extrapolated sea voyages and made them travelers to the moon. They were the gist of the story is that they're happily sailing along the sea. They encounter a hell of a whirlwind that transports them to the moon, and it's obviously a pretty intriguing concept. And as you mentioned about the movies, we've seen that in other movies that have shown these, rather, let's say, imaginary sailings off to the moon. You and I had discussed before we began this program, one of the more famous ones is the writer, the French writer Sinéad de Bergerac, who wrote a book called The Other World, and this is back in 1657. And the fictionalized Cyrano attempts to reach the moon by harnessing solar power, and it's a combination of a hot air balloon and a solar balloon. So it's kind of fun jumping into this stuff to see how people imagined it. I mean, you need to have, I think anyway, and I kind of have the luxury. I live in a fairly remote part on an island in Greece, so I literally see the sky pretty much unadulterated, and I have given up how many times, trying to count how many times I've just watched the moon rise and the moon set off the back of my deck. This gorgeous white orb. And be looking at it, how writers would have been inspired by it. You can you can get lost in the science of it. I mean, and I have, but it's when you put all of that science, all those books away, all those studies of trajectories, all the science that I had read to understand the moon landing, you put all that to the side, and it is really inspirational. The moon is a very inspirational thing. There was one story I wanted to tell you, which is kind of interesting. Is we tend to think of, or we're used to anyway today, of thinking of, what I would say the current crop of science fiction authors. I mean, even if you take, and when I say current crop, I mean, I'm going far as H.G. Wells. I mean,
yeah.
There's a long story about when Clark had begun writing extensively, and he also had gone all the way back to the time of writing about Jules Verne and some other people. He started writing about H.G. Wells, and he basically said that H.G. Wells' book, The First Men on the Moon, 1901, was probably the first most popular book. And it was popular because it was more it was more realistic. H.G. Wells inserted, as he would in much of his writings, a lot of science, but he proposed for the first time, the concepts of anti-gravity. He proposed propelling yourself to the moon in a spherical steel vessel. He had two highly trained, intelligent astronauts. So he kind of, propelled us into thinking more and more of the realistic nature of, wow, maybe we can actually get to the moon. And other authors followed in his footsteps. You're going back to movies again. Fritz Lang has a movie that he produced in 1929 called Woman in the Moon. And again, it is a mix of fact and fiction. But this is a very, very important book. And just bear with me here while I try to connect the dots. It inspired an aeronautical engineer called Wernher von Braun. And we know that Wernher von Braun was behind the Nazi development of long-range, highly sophisticated rockets. Why? We know through history that Hitler had very much wanted to bomb London, but not by plane. He wanted to do it by rocket. But the rockets that were then available and the technology that was then available weren't around. So the Nazis developed some very, very sophisticated rocket technology. And after the war, the U.S. basically captured that technology, as it were, hired von Braun and a bunch of scientists that he had worked with, brought them to the United States. So in a manner of speaking, if you want to connect the dots, the movie that Fritz Lang had produced in 1929 was inspired by H.G. Wells back in 1901. And if it wasn't for von Braun being impressed, and if you trace all the way back, man landing on the moon is in a way can be attributed to the Nazis.
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
If you really want to go crazy and connect all of that. So and that's the fascinating thing, and we've discussed this before on other kinds of literature, that when you see people's inspirations and you track it through and you spend the time, and not everybody has the time, you find out that nothing develops in the world, whether it's technology, politics, culture, in a linear fashion. It gets inspiration from all kinds of bumps and pieces of things. So when you trace it back and you see how this literature developed, when you see, for instance, there's another novel which was written in 1951. I've forgotten the author's name, which is embarrassing, which is called Prelude to Space. It's a novel, but it is so scientifically written that in the late 50s, the book came out in 51, 52, in the late 50s, when the U.S. realized that the Russians were going to challenge them in space, they had looked at that book. There were lots of good ideas in it. And it was incorporated into the U.S. space research and U.S. space program. And I think we've talked about the science fiction writer, and you may have to fix my pronunciation here, but Ursula Le Guin, is it Le Guin?
Yeah.
Le Guin. She also was inspired. And she had written several science fiction stories about the idea of colonizing space. So all of this stuff, I mean, we all know that science fiction writers, writers of, let's call it science literature, are very much inspired by real things. We hit our problem, I think, very often in technology is we sit there and we go, oh, this guy is a science fiction writer. Wow, some of the stuff he predicted, it's come true. Yeah, but he also was inspired by things that were actually happening. So, it's a two-way street. And if you go back and look at, and I'm just throwing out a couple of names here, besides Ursula, if you look at other science fiction writers like Hopkinson or Sargent or Robinson, their writings ignited a more intense interest in both not only the moon, but space travel in general. And I've always found that to be utterly fascinating. And it's obviously more fascinating if you have an intense interest in it. And because, as you and I discussed, I think it was sometime last week, when I was a kid, 11, 12 years old, and I used to visit my aunt and uncle in Florida because my uncle worked at then what was called Cape Canaveral. I was able to get onto the research centers. I got to meet astronauts in training. I got to meet people that I didn't realize at the time were pretty sophisticated engineers. And that's inspired me. And that, I find, probably did two things. It certainly inspired me for more sophisticated learning. When I was at university, in the U.S. system at the time, one had a major and one had a minor.
Yeah.
And my major at the time was economics, but my minor was physics. I was just bowled over by aerospace, and it led me to take my minor degree in it. And then, as the years progressed, I don't think any of that stuff is ever forgotten. But when the U.S. space program developed, and we had the Mercury group and the Gemini group and then the Apollo group, it just led me down that road to basically read everything, but then also branch out. And as I indicated at the beginning, I think it was that until I started preparing a year ago, a little more than a year ago, for this 50th anniversary, I didn't realize that there was out there over 2 millennia of lunar literature and just tons of stuff. Much of it forgotten, much of it out of print. Some are still. And when I was doing the research at the museum in Washington, D.C., I was gobsmacked by how many of these guys could quote, science fiction books they had read, and it was wonderful because, you tend to, I think the problem with this, and we've had this discussion for lack of a better phrase, that boring area called e-discovery and information governance. It's amazing. We've always talked about how so many people in our industry, despite all the talk of advanced technology and collaboration, still live in silos, and they can't get out of those silos. And I think the reason, to give us both a pat on the back, I think the reason both of us have been successful is the fact that we have left those silos a long time ago. And we were open to, so many different things that, we can, I think anyway, I mean, people have said this about you for certain. You can talk about so many different things with deep knowledge because you don't treat things superficially. You look at things from every single angle. And I think I've tried to adopt that approach for sure. And when I began the heavy duty research and heavy duty reading for this 50th anniversary, which I got to celebrate, by the way, at the observatory in Crete. Let me tell you, for a small island and for all of the crap that Greece has gone through, it's a pretty sophisticated place. I got to sit there with all kinds of astrophysicist friends of mine, both people that had backgrounds in physics and people that didn't. And we all shared, this wide knowledge base. There were a few chaps there that could, run circles around me as far as the science, which was fine. But we we all had this feeling of, again, the literature. And I think it's not only because the Greeks tend to be a somewhat over-romantic clique, but it's also because, as I said again earlier, there are places, and I'm sure they exist in the UK, there are places where you can have these unadulterated looks at the sky.
Yes.
And you can see, you literally, to the naked eye, you can see whole galaxies in front of you. And I think that the reason that the moon has had such a tremendous effect is, number one, it's close to the point you can almost touch it. Number two, it's the brightest point in the sky. Mm-hmm. And number three, it's, we've been there.
Yes.
Man has not yet landed any place else. And that, I think, there were something like 16 Apollo flights.
Yes.
And six moon landings, each one, offering another element of mission. And what's most interesting is many of the moon rocks and many of the geology samples that were picked up by the earlier Apollo crews in 70 and 71, it wasn't until the last 4 or 5 years that we've finally developed the analytical technology to look at these things. So they're being pulled off the shelves, after 45, 50 years. They're given a relook. And the point I'm making is, what's interesting is it's leading, one of the science fiction writers, Neil Stephenson, mentioned this in an interview a couple of weeks ago. It's given him now and other people an idea of, oh, wow, now they found XYZ on this rock from the moon. Here's an idea for us. So it's, it just keeps going on and on and on and on. And I have always told people that, the reason that the moon, I think, is a fascinating object is it is a romantic object. And it is a imaginary inspirational object. So it's easy to write about when it comes to poetry or literature. And as you know, Gilbert and Sullivan, in their classic Mikado, which I think is my favorite of all their works, they wrote a song completely about the moon and its effect on human nature. And the Mikado was early 1900s. Mm-hmm. I've kind of I'm a little dim on my Gilbert and Sullivan, but they had written a lovely song, and I have seen that perform. I've seen this performance live, and I have several recordings of it. And when you listen to it, it literally captivates the moon's romance, beauty, and effect on the human psyche. And you take all this stuff together and you realize that, I can sit all day and tell you about what I've learned about the moon's atmosphere, what I've learned about the moon's gravity, etc. When I put all those books away, when I shove all those papers back onto the table, I start looking at that thing, I'm gone. There's one sentence in the blog post I'm writing about it, and I think I shared it with you. I can't remember. But I want to read it to you because it kind of captures, my whole thing. To me, the moon is never the same because it sits differently in different skies. And yet, it is always the same. It's the same thing you saw when you first saw it. Though that first sighting, you probably will never remember, any more than you will know for sure when you see it for the final time.
And we'll have the second and concluding part of my interview with Gregory Bufithis here on Weird Tales Radio Show next week. Here's a tale of a local haunting, which at first seems straightforward enough, but when you scratch the surface you think, well, this may well be an old legend that has become effectively an urban myth, a medieval urban myth. The story is that the location is the Waveney Valley town of Beccles, which is not very far from where the studios of the Weird Tales Radio Show are located. And the story is that there is a recurring sighting on the 31st of August of 3 rat catchers who helped remove rats from the town of Beccles during the period of the Black Death, the rats obviously being carriers of bubonic plague. So the story is that the town was overrun with rats, and 3 local men negotiated a deal with the town's corporation and guilds that in an exchange for a sum of money, they would rid the town of rats. This they did by playing musical instruments, which so enchanted the rats that they followed the men out of the town, across the nearby marshes, down to the banks of the River Waveney, where they all fell into the river and drowned. But strangely, the 3 men never returned to claim their payment, and in fact were never seen again. Now the legend says that the 3 men had sold their souls to a group of witches in exchange for the magical secret of how to enchant rats. But, as so often happens with demonic pacts in folklore, there was a catch, and as soon as the rats were swept away by the waters of the river, the 3 men were swallowed up by the fires of hell. Their only respite from eternal damnation is, apparently, once a year on the 31st of August, their ghosts can be seen standing on the banks of the River Waveney. Now, this is a curious legend for Suffolk, as although there is little doubt reports of towns being overrun with rats and then succumbing to outbreaks of the bubonic plague would have been lingering long in the collective memory. The bubonic plague, the Black Death, was particularly virulent in parts of East Anglia, with in some instances 60% of the population being wiped out. You can't help notice that the story seems to share a strong element with the German tale of the Pied Piper of Hamelin, which has been known since the 14th century, which is also the time of the Black Death. So was this a local Suffolk version of that tale, or was there something else? Well, scratch the surface and you do find an incident in the town's historical record that may offer an explanation for the legend of the 3 burning men. It was during the reign of Queen Mary Tudor, otherwise known as Bloody Mary, who made an attempt to restore Roman Catholicism as the official religion of England, and this saw the persecution of followers of the new Protestant faith. Suffolk, including Beccles, was not immune from the so-called Marian persecutions, and on the 21st of May 1556, 3 men, Thomas Spence, John Denny, and Edmund Poole, were all put to death by being burned at the stake in the old market square in Beccles. So perhaps this real-life tragedy became conflated with accounts of the Black Death and the story of the Pied Piper of Hamelin. I leave you to make your own decision on this. And that's it, we're out of time. This is Charles Christian here saying we'll be back next week, same time, same place, for another episode of the Weird Tales radio show. All that remains for me to say is thank you for listening. Please listen again. We appreciate your ears. And until the next time, stay well, stay weird.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon, which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic and folklore. You can keep in touch with us online at www.weirdtalesradio.com, by email to weirdtales@icloud.com, and on Twitter @urbanfantasist. Join us again next week for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show. Good night.
This podcast is a part of Straight Up Strange Productions. Discover more shows like this one at straightupstrange.com.